it came up short in a few areas. And then we found out about rate monotonic analysis, which Chakravarti touched on, but didn't really give anywhere near enough time and detail to. And then we watched the DVD, which, as I mentioned at the time, was content-rich, let's say. And I told you not to panic too much about that, because this week we'd be going through a couple of documents that allowed us to practice what was in the video at a more measured pace, and that should put everyone's minds at rest. So we'll do that, and then we'll have a look at some of the tutorial problems that we didn't do last week, and that we will do this week, and then we'll be pretty much up to date. I'll mention this again at the end of the lecture, but just at the moment while I'm thinking of it, next week's stuff will include a variation to rate monotonic called deadline monotonic. Now, you might remember Ruth mentioned pre-period deadlines in the video we watched last week, but she mentioned two techniques for dealing with those. With rate monotonic analysis, we are assuming that the deadlines for the processes are coincident with their periods. But a generalisation of that is that the deadlines might be a certain fixed time before the end of the period, and that's called deadline monotonic analysis. And she mentioned a couple of techniques for modelling that, but they were pretty much hacked, and we won't do it that way. Instead, I recommend you download a copy of this document, which I've just made available on UTS Online. It's a technical paper written a few years back now. And even though it might appear a bit historical, it's, as I mentioned before, still topical in terms of, in fact, it's definitely topical in terms of current practice in real-time systems management. The paper is long and detailed, but we'll only be doing the first 18 pages of it. It's up to you whether or not you think you want to print the big out and bring it along to the lecture, or just work from the PDF version of the document that's available online, whatever you think is easiest for you. About the first 5 pages is a recap of stuff that we're going to be looking at tonight anyway. We don't have to worry about that too much. And it's a sensible recap to have a look at. However, after about page 5 or 6, he starts getting into, the author, Neil Worsley, starts getting into this deadline monotonic stuff, which we really want to have a look at. And it involves mathematical techniques which are a little different from the ones that we're going to be looking at tonight, but not too complicated. As well as that document, which we'll be looking at next week, there's another set of lecture slides that I'm going to do a voiceover for dynamic scheduling. So I'll update this entry in the subject documents before next week with some PowerPoint slides and another FP4 file. But it's really important that you have this document in front of you before we deal with the content of it next week. So one way or the other, get yourself a copy of that document before then, and the other stuff I'll add in during the week. It's not quite so important. Well, it's still significant, but you don't have to have too much of it in readiness beforehand. Anyone got any questions before we get started? All right, then we should do that. The documents we're going to have a look at are the so-called homework assignments 1 and 2 that I pointed towards last week. Don't worry about them being called homework assignments, because, as I said before, they're not homework. They're what we're going to do in class here. However, there are some tutorial problems that we'll look at either next week or the week after, whenever, that do on this stuff. So you'll get to do some tutorial problems on it, but I will work through these 2 documents slowly and methodically now, so that you get a good opportunity to absorb what we looked at in the lecture last week. Okay. All right, so let's have a look at these questions. The first one has got a task set, 4 tasks, execution times, periods listed there. The very first part of the question says list them in rate monotonic order, highest priority first. Who can do that for us? P, G, X and S. Why? Because rate monotonic priority assignment looks at the periods of the processes and assigns highest priority to shortest period. Where do the periods from the processes come from? Do we A, make them up, B, ask someone else for them, or C, don't know?
You get that from the system constraints?
That's right. B, we ask someone else for them. And that someone else is the domain expert of the system for which we are building our real-time system. So we're building the real-time computer system. It's obviously going to be interacting with some other complex, non-linear, time-varying system, whatever it is. And the domain expert for that tells us what the periods should be, because that's their baby, that's their area. They tell us what the periods need to be. We take those as axiomatic, we can't change them, can't modify them. Maybe we wish we could, tough, you can't. And it's our job to build a system that can comply with those. What do we do if we've got a process that is aperiodic amongst the collection? Do we A, pretend we didn't see it? Or B, acknowledge it's there but ignore it? Or C, something else?
Assume the worst case.
That's right. It'll come with a response time attached to it. In other words, it'll come with a time interval over which it must be able to wake up and complete execution after some triggering event for it has occurred. And the thing is, that triggering event doesn't occur periodically, as it does with a periodic process. So what we must do is assume worst case, and assume that the triggering event occurs for every response time seconds. How can we safely say every response time seconds and not some effective period which is even shorter than that? Why can we get away with saying the response time is a good enough effective period and not maybe some time interval which is shorter than that? Well, that's because, again, the domain expert tells us that when this triggering event occurs, our system must respond within that many seconds. If it's safe to respond within that many seconds, no less, no more, then that logically, to us, is what the effective period should be in the worst case scenario. So we're perfectly justified in doing that. What does that mean about the specification for our system? After we've used worst case analysis, what does that mean about the specification for our system in terms of the resource requirements that it's going to expect or demand? Those resource requirements will be excessive, won't they? They'll be conservative. It's always the case. When we model something on a worst case scenario, with the expectation that that worst case scenario won't occur all the time, or we really have got problems, then we'll end up building a system which is conservative in that it will have a greater resource requirement than that which it will need in most operating situations, which means it's not really efficient. It's not really a system which is utilised most efficiently. But is that a problem to us? No, couldn't care less. As long as it is guaranteed to always meet its deadlines, then we've achieved our objective. Whether it happens to be excessive in terms of the hardware requirements that we end up determining it needs, not our problem. Someone else pays for that. Our mission is to make sure that under all scenarios, every task will meet its deadlines. That's it. Whatever it takes to have that happen, that's what we That's what we deliver. Right, well, that was a pretty long-winded answer to the very first simple question, wasn't it? Okay, in the following problems, when you're asked to use theorem 1, write the expression algebraically and then write it again plugging in the numbers. That's actually very good advice. And I recommend you do that in the exam, where there will definitely be questions like this, because if you just throw some numbers at me and those numbers are incorrect, then it's difficult for me to find a way to give you any sort of reward for that. However, if you've written an algebraic expression down correctly, then I'm going to be less likely to be concerned about the numbers too much, even though we should plug them in and evaluate it. So, writing down an expression, a correct expression, in algebraic form, is where the real value added is in all this stuff. So I recommend you follow that advice. If you're asked to use theorem 2, show a timeline. And it says here, use the blank one provided. Yes, well, in terms of the tutorial problems and in the exam questions, I'll provide the timeline if I think you need one. And then it says, state your conclusion specifically. For example, theorem 2 is satisfied for task whatever at scheduling point whatever. Right, that's a conclusive statement. If you are asked, are these tasks schedulable, use theorem 1 first, and if that's sufficient to answer the questions, fine. If not, use theorem 2. Does that make sense? What's the difference between theorums 1 and 2? What's theorem 1 look like? Well, it's a damn sight cleaner than theorem 2, that's for sure. There's theorem 1, up the top there. That's Ewan Leyland's theorem from their landmark paper in 1973. And that's the rate monotonic test for schedulability. Don't worry about committing it to memory, because in the exam paper I'll provide the formula that you need. I've got that written down on the formula sheet for you. We've got better ways of destroying brain cells than by committing useless formula to memory. All right, well that's it. And what does this equation tell us? It's an inequality, obviously. What does it tell us? What's it comparing? There's something on the left and something on the right. What is that something on the left? In plain English. The sum of the C of I over the T of I. The execution times of the processes divided by their respective periods. If we add all that up, what is that quantity? What is that sum? That sum is the total processing utilisation. The total amount of time the process is busy executing programs that we've given it to execute, running processes. So, the left-hand side of the inequality is the total processing utilisation. What's this stuff on the right-hand side then? This n outside of 2 to 1 on n minus 1 business. What do we call that thing? That thing is the theoretical upper bound on processor utilisation. So that's what Ewan Leyland derived for us. They said the total processor utilisation, which is what we've got on the left-hand side of the inequality, must be less than or equal to their calculated theoretical upper bound. Right, so actual must be less than or equal to theoretical. That sounds good. And we note that the theoretical upper bound approaches 69% as n approaches infinity. It starts at 1 and it geometrically converges on 69.3%. What do we do if that inequality is not satisfied?
Theorem 2.
That's right. Because theorem 1 is conservative, isn't it? It is sufficient but not necessary, as the mathematicians like to say. Which means if we plug in the numbers and inequality satisfied, then we're happy, but we don't burst into tears if the numbers don't add up. Instead, we apply theorem 2, and there is theorem 2. This is often incorrectly attributed also to Liu and Leyland, but it was Lahosky, Shah and Ding that came up with this many years later. So this is the more accurate expression. And once again, don't bother committing that one to memory, because like Ruth mentioned last week, it's a bit user hostile, and although we can implement that in some form of algorithm, we're better off applying theorem 2, not in its symbolic form like that, but in the graphical form. In other words, plotting out the timelines. So, where it's recommended to us that we apply theorem 1 first, and only if we get disappointed there do we apply theorem 2. That kind of makes sense. We apply theorem 1 because it's nice and simple and easy, and if it tells us what we need to know, then we don't have to do any more. But if it leaves us without a conclusive result, then we apply theorem 2. Okay. That all straightforward so far? Nice and easy. Okay. This is where we start to do a little bit of extra work. When it says, if you're asked to use the extended model for theorem 1, then use an expression that includes preemption factors, task execution factors, and blocking factors. And we don't know what those mean yet. We saw them in last week's video, but I don't expect many people absorb that, which is, again, why we're doing all this now. So we'll see what they mean by the extended model for theorem 1 as we work through these problems here. That's what it's all about. Okay, so question 2. Based on this ordering, are the tasks with the 2 highest priorities schedulable? What would we do now? We would apply Liu and Leyland's theorem 1 because it's nice and easy. Are the tasks with the 2 highest priorities schedulable? If we skip forward, we can do that ourselves, but if we skip forward and have a look at their answers, which is what we would do anyway, then yes, we can see that P is schedulable and that P and G are schedulable. The trivial test for one task is, of course, is its execution time less than its period? We could have worked that out as being the essential test for any task. If its execution time is not less than its period, then we're not going any further with that one. However, what we've got here is we've got task G. Again, we need to make sure its execution time is less than its period. It goes without saying. But when task G runs, because it's lower priority than task P, that means task P can run multiple times during task G's period, doesn't it? Yes, it does. P's period must be shorter than G's period, because P is higher priority than G. So, as well as G having an execution time which is less than its period, it needs to also accommodate the fact that when it wants to run, it might be preempted by task P. That's why we've got these sum of the ratios, execution times divided by periods. All right, that's good. No headache so far. Are all 4 tasks schedulable? And if not, why not? Well, once again, we apply theorem 1. They've simply repeated what they've got above there for the first 2 tasks. That's fine. Then we've included task X, which is the 3rd highest priority task. And we can see that the inequality is not satisfied there, and they've written not schedulable. Now that's not correct, is it? No. What would we write? That's right. We would write that. Because theorem 1 is conservative, isn't it? It's sufficient but not necessary. All right, and then for the last task, task S, we're doing the same thing again. We've got preemption factors, When task S wants to run, because it's the lowest priority task in the system, it can be preempted by any of the higher priority tasks, maybe multiple times. So that's what the CP over TP plus the CG over TG plus the CX over TX represents. And then of course we've got CS over TS, and that all needs to be less than or equal to n outside of 2 to the 1 on n minus 1, where n equals 4, which it's not. And so once again, we should be writing may not be schedulable. Yes, mate?
Do we have to do this test when we already know that the X may not be scheduled?
That's a good question. That's a good question, and yes, we do. Reason being, we will get more information about the tasks which are causing us to miss deadlines if we evaluate this for each of them. Because in a real design scenario, it's no good for us to just do the maths and say, no, sorry boss, it ain't going to work. They're going to come back and say, well, why isn't it working? Which task or tasks are missing their deadlines? Fix it. And that's what we would need to do. Yeah. All right, so we've discovered that of the 4 tasks, 2 may not be schedulable. And of course, what that does mean is that we need to apply theorem 2, which has been done here, but again in the graphical form, not the symbolic form. And so what we've done is we've sketched the tasks executing in the time domain, and there's a certain technique involved in doing this properly too. On the timeline, and so if you have to do this in the exam or in your tutorial problems, I'll produce blank timelines for you to use. Right, so they'll all be done as sort of semi-scale, good enough. And then you can just sketch in the execution sequence like this. What we should do is we should always put the highest priority task at the top and have them ordered rate monotonically with the lowest one at the bottom. And we should show, we should sketch in these processes executing right across for each process, right across the timeline for each process before moving down to the next highest priority process and doing that one. So we put P at the top and we sketch it executing every time it needs to execute for as many periods as we need. And only when we've done that do we move down to G, the next highest priority process, and we sketch it executing when it needs to. And then we move down to X, and in this case, yes, the last one. All right, so because P is the highest priority task in the system, we show it executing whenever it wants, because it's the highest priority task. So every 50 time units, milliseconds or whatever they are, doesn't really matter. Every 50 time units, we show P executing for 20. And that's what's shown there. That's all sketched in. Right, nothing to it. And of course, in the worst case scenario, where all tasks want to run at the same time, if time t equals 0 here, we would have G attempting to start at time t equals 0, but because we've got a uniprocessor system and only one task will be running at any one time, then G will be delayed. It won't start executing until time t equals 20. It'll run down to 45 and it'll finish because its execution time was 25 time units and its period was 80. So at time t equals 80, it'll start running again for the second iteration. It'll get as far as 100, where it'll be preempted by the higher priority task P, and then it'll be allowed to resume at 125, at 120, sorry, and complete at 125. Well in advance for the second period, which is 160. That's right. Okay, X wants to start at time t equals 0 as well, but it's delayed until 45. That's a bit not much contrast here on the diagram. It starts at 45, it gets preempted at 50, it resumes again at 70 and concludes at 75, which is fine because its execution time is 10 and its period is 100. So it's easily meeting its deadlines. It should be starting on its second run here at time t equals 100, but it's delayed until 25, but it easily finishes at 35. Where I've got the mouse now, finishes at 35 there. 135, pardon me. Yeah. So, whereas Liu and Leyland's theorem 1 suggested to us that the top three tasks, P, G and X, may not be schedulable. It turns out Theorem 2 tells us they are. And then we'll finish off with S. S wants to start at time t equals 0 as well, but it doesn't get an opportunity to run, it doesn't even get an opportunity to be moved to the active state until 75. It executes there for 5 time units until time t equals 80, where it's preempted by G, and then G gets preempted by P, and then G's allowed to resume, and then X will run, and then S finally gets to finish off executing at time t equals, what's that, 135, and it finishes at 150, exactly on. So it too, S as well, with its 20 time units of execution required, still meets its deadline by 150, and so the indication we got from Theorem 1 was again misleading. And what we would write is something like this. Theorem 2 is satisfied at scheduling point 150, t equals 150, because X completes at 135 and S completes right on its deadline. So all tasks are in fact scheduled. Okay. Any questions about that one? No, nice and easy. It's just quite straightforward, applying Theorem 1. When Theorem 1 needs extra help, we apply Theorem 2. Yes, ma'am? Which task has run twice? X? Yeah, that's right, that's fine. Yeah, yep, yep. Yeah, X's deadline is 100 and its execution time is 10. That's right. No, that's okay. What we want to do is to make sure that by the first deadline of the lowest priority task, that all the other tasks have met their deadlines. That's our goal. Yes?
I'm sorry, where do you get the values for U1, U2?
That's n outside of 2 to 1 on n minus 1. Yeah, so we plug n equals 1, or n equals 2, or n equals 3, or n equals 4 into this. Okay? Which, like it says there, converges on 69.3% as n approaches infinity. All right. Yeah, that's good. Keep these questions going because it's easier to fix them up now than it is later on in the course. All right.
Sorry, just on
Yes, mate.
just on X. So if
Yes.
that, so if 5 was to move after 100 time units, but within the 150, it's still a complete execution.
No, X's deadline, X's first deadline is at 100. Okay, there's X's period. And it needs to complete 10 units of execution by 100 time units. It manages to get 5 in there, where I've got the mouse now.
Yep.
And it manages to get another 5 in there, which is good because its first deadline's here. Its second deadline is right down here, somewhere, 200. And it clearly manages to meet that. So, X is able to execute well within its deadline. All right. Okay. Now we start getting into some variations. Change the problem as follows. Assume that task S, that's the lowest priority one, executes as an interrupt instead of at its rate monotonic priority. Use Theorem 2, the timeline, to show whether all 4 tasks are schedulable, and if not, which one or ones miss their deadlines. So finally we're getting around to adjusting these rather limiting assumptions that were made about the processes right back at the beginning when we looked at this rate monotonic analysis. analysis. Remember, there can be a fixed number of tasks, they all have different priorities, they've all got different periods that follows. They're all independent, and they all run in rate monotonic order. Those limitations are now being relaxed. We're getting to something that's a little bit more realistic, where we've got a task which is running out of rate monotonic order. This one's being run now as an interrupt service routine. Okay, S is being run as an interrupt-driven task, an interrupt service routine, instead of a rate monotonic priority. So this is a bit more realistic. We go straight to theorem 2. That's what it's telling us to do. We won't always do that. This time around we do. We go straight to theorem 2, and there's the outcome. We've still got P drawn at the top there, because it's the highest priority task in rate monotonic order. Then we've got G and X and S, that's fine. Only this time round, things have changed a little bit, because at time t equals 0, when they all hear the starter's gun, and off they go, S runs first now, instead of P. Why is that?
Interrupt service routines have priority.
You bet they do. That's right. The interrupt service routine is being scheduled by the hardware, right? So the hardware event occurs, and the machine finishes executing the currently executed instruction, and finishes the current instruction. Then it jumps to the interrupt service routine, pushes registers on stacks, executes that, pops registers off stacks, and comes back. Right? That's all managed by the hardware. It doesn't matter about what operating system is running, let alone what scheduler is running, whether it's rate monotonic or whether it's round robin or something else. Right? The scheduler doesn't get a look in. This is all being determined at the hardware level. So when the hardware says this process runs now, in other words, we start executing the interrupt service routine, we do. So at time t equals 0, when all the starting events occur, S overrides everything else because it's being scheduled by the hardware. So it runs for the first 20 time units. Obviously, it's going to meet its deadline. Right? That's not in question. But only after we return from the interrupt service routine can we start running the other tasks in the order that the operating system scheduler demands that they be run, which is P, G, and then X. So we show P running, starting at time t equals 20 and finishing at 40. That's fine, it meets its deadline. It runs again at 50, it finishes at 70, and it runs at 100 and finishes at 120. So P doesn't suffer any impact from that modification. However, G is going to miss a deadline because it doesn't get to start until 40. It gets preempted at time t equals 50 because P wants to run, and P is higher priority, so it does. It'll resume at 70, but at time t equals 70, it's still got 15 time units of execution to run. So it misses its first deadline, which is at 80, by 5 time units. So modifying task S to be an interrupt service routine instead of a normal user level process running at whatever priority it should run at, rate monotonically speaking, by making that modification, we've ruined the task schedulability for G. And same thing happens for X. X was supposed to have a deadline of 100. It didn't even get to start to run until 130. Now, I don't know whether you remember, but last week when Ruth was telling us about that case study of the IBM submarine trainer, one of the things that they were planning on doing, apart from the other hack stand approaches that they had, one of the things that they were going to do was they were going to move application processing down into the interrupt level because they thought it being closer to the hardware down there to execute faster, which it probably would, but it would present precisely this problem here, whereby we've got a task which is running out of rate monotonic order and acting as a blocking factor to all the higher priority tasks. Right, so here, S, which should be the lowest priority task, is running out of rate monotonic order. This is called priority inversion. Right? Make a note of that, priority inversion. And it's when tasks are running out of rate monotonic order, and when they do, they act as blocking factors on higher priority tasks. There's a fair bit in that sentence, I might repeat that. When tasks are running out of rate monotonic order, it's called priority inversion, and they act as blocking factors on higher priority tasks. So, our modification there has taken us great strides in reverse doing that. Okay, question 5 says, based on the modifications we made in question 4, change it again. Assume that S is a task that involves 10 units of interrupt processing and then 10 units of application processing. Use the extended model for theorem 1, right, we're going to see that for the first time now, to determine if this solves the schedulability problem. So, they're going to hack their code for the second time. They're going to say, right, instead of making task S the whole thing in interrupt service routine, instead, let's make just the first 10 time units, 10 milliseconds of it, interrupt driven, and then just set a flag to indicate that there's still some processing to do. But let that remainder processing, let that remaining 10 milliseconds of execution, let that be run as a normal process at rate monotonic level, user level. Right, so only 10 milliseconds is now an interrupt service routine, the rest of it gets done at user level. That makes sense? Okay, well, we're going to use now the extended model for theorem 1. Right? That's what they talk about. If you ask to use the extended model for theorem 1, use an expression that includes preemption factors, task execution factors, and blocking factors. We just discovered what a blocking factor was. In plain English, what is a blocking factor?
An even higher priority task.
Yeah, it's a task running out of rate monotonic order. That's right, that's a blocking factor, and it impacts higher priority tasks. Okay. So now we've got an expression that looks like this. There's task P's own execution time divided by its period. That's normal. Just as we surmised right back at the beginning, its execution time is going to be less than its period. That goes without saying. However, this time around, we've got the interrupt portion of task S also occurring during task P's period, and so we've got CSI over TP must be less than or equal to U of 1, which is n outside of 2 is 1 and n minus 1, when n is 1. Turned out to be 1. This is probably the thing that confuses most people. That bit that I've got highlighted down. We've got CP over TP plus CSI, but not over TS, over TP. Why? It seems to be wrong compared to the expressions that we should be comfortable with now, like those ones there, where everything is CI over TI.
Because it can be scheduled any time, CP can be scheduled.
That's right. Because this is acting as a blocking factor, CSI is acting as a blocking factor during task P's period. Right? Blocking factors always have an impact up the pecking order, right? Up towards the higher priority processes. So we need to show that task P can not only accommodate its own execution time within its own period, which is, like I've said a couple of times now, the no-brainer requirement, but also within its own period, task P's own period, it has to be able to accommodate the blocking factor posed by task S. So there's the extended model for theorem 1. We've got the task's own execution factor here, plus a blocking factor there. And we need that to be less than or equal to 1, which it is. And again, as I mentioned before, the real intellectual value that I want to see when marking problems like this in the exam is expressions like that. That tells me you know what you're talking about. Okay, what about for task G? We've got CP over TP plus CG over TG. That's as we expected. But again, CSI over TG, because when TG wants to run, it's got to accommodate its own execution time within its own period. That's fine. It's also got to accommodate the fact that it might be preempted by task P, and task P has got a shorter period, and the fact that this blocking factor can impact it as well. So CSI over TG must be less than or equal to U of 2, not U of 3. So we're not simply looking at how many terms we put over here and putting that in brackets there. So CP over TP plus CG over TG plus CSI over TG must be less than or equal to 2. Sorry, U of 2. And it's not. When we plug in the numbers. But we keep going anyway. Next one, CP over TP plus CG over TG. A little bit of OCR problem there. That's not 4 minus, that's plus 0. Okay, so CP over TP plus CG over TG, they're the preemption factors on task X. Task X's own execution factor, and then the blocking factor on task X. So, going back up here, and noting where it says write down expressions that include preemption factors, task execution factors, and blocking factors, we can see that we're doing that precisely as described down here. This one has no preemption factor because it's a high priority task in the system, so it can't be preempted. But it does have a task execution factor, that's what that is, and it does have a blocking factor, that's what that is. For this task, task G, it can be preempted by task P, so it has a preemption factor. It's got its own task execution factor and a blocking factor. And task X can be preempted by 2 processes. So we've got 2 terms there that make up the preemption factor. Then the task's own execution factor, and then the blocking factor. Alright, and so for the last task, task S, CP over TP plus CG over TG plus CX over TX plus CS over TS, less than or equal to U of 4. Where's our blocking factor gone? Gone AWOL. Why is blocking factor not there anymore? So, big man, yeah. It can't block itself. This is the one that's blocking the higher priority processes. And so, from its perspective of the machine runtime environment, there is no blocking factor. It's doing the blocking. All it sees is higher priority tasks that might want to run when it wants to run. So we've got 3 terms there making up the preemption factor. Plus, it's got to do its own execution time within its own period. End of story. So the blocking factor doesn't actually disappear. It's not apparent to the task which is doing the blocking. It's only felt by the higher priority tasks. That's what blocking factors are all about. They have ramifications, as I mentioned before, further back up the food chain, up towards the high priority processes. Right, so who's got some questions on this one? Yeah?
I don't get why we divide CSI by TG and not by TP in the second task.
Because as far as task G goes, task P is just some other high priority process that runs whenever it wants. And the only other thing that's got to accommodate, again, within its own period. is the blocking factor from the lower priority task to task S.
But if it would be okay now, let's say it would be, we could schedule task G from the numbers.
Yes.
And then CSI could, no, it could, yeah.
Is that correct?
No,
It does take a little bit of thinking about, and one of the things I discovered when I was looking at this first time around is you can't let your intuition get in the way, unfortunately, with this stuff. All right, so when task G wants to run, that portion of the test is obvious. So is that, and this can happen, of course, multiple times within task G's period. We don't know how much shorter P's period is than G, only that it is shorter. And so this might happen 2 or 3 times within task G's period. That's possible. But this can only happen once in task G's period. We know that because S has a longer period than G. That help?
yeah.
All right. Okay, question 6. Suppose the conditions of question 5 hold again. Where would you first direct your attention in an attempt to make this task set schedulable? That is, which task or tasks contribute most to the fact that the set is not schedulable? This is where theorem 1 is better than just some abstract test that we can apply and get a yes or no from. There's enough information presented to us in the process of applying theorem 1 for us to learn a good deal more about the way in which the tasks are behaving and interacting with one another, which can feed back towards the modification of the design of the system. Right? So it's not just a matter of, like we said last week, of some magic 8 ball that tells you a yes or a no. There's more information available to us. So it says, okay, if we've got a problem here, basically, what are we going to do about it? So a very realistic question. If we go straight down to the recommended answer to question 6, it says P due to high utilisation or G if justified based on timeline. All right. How are they coming up with an answer or response like that? Well, the second part is pretty straightforward. Because G is the first task to miss a deadline, that's naturally where we would begin to focus any remedial efforts to try and fix this thing. Right? We'd naturally home in on task G and try and find some way of dealing with that because it's the first one that misses its deadline, so that's pretty obvious. But the first part, P due to high utilisation, how does that make sense? Yeah. P is the highest priority task in the system, and it's got a 40% utilisation. That's not a good combination in terms of the fact that, as they say there, P based on high utilisation, 40%. And because it's the highest priority task in the system, that higher utilisation will affect all other tasks in the system. It mightn't be so much of a problem if some of the lower priority tasks have a utilisation of 40%, but when it's the highest priority task in the system has got a utilisation of 40%, that has a knock-on effect, which is visible to them all. And so, yes, we would probably look at ways of trying to reduce the execution time for task P, wouldn't we? Yeah. In fact, we might be able to leave G alone. If we can prune 5 units of execution time off task P, then G will meet its deadline without any modifications made to it at all. So what do? We rewrite 17,000 lines of Ada in C, don't we? Yeah. And then compile it with maximum optimization and hope for the best. Okay. Does that all make sense?
By a faster process.
Yeah, that's right. That's the other way. But you might never say that. You might be able to do that.
Someone else's problem.
Yeah, that's right. Someone else's problem. Yeah. Now you might be you might have to build something on someone else's equipment that they've already made a commitment to. Yeah. You haven't always got that much freedom. Yeah. Okay. But you would if you could, of course. 7. What does it mean if a task set of n tasks fails both theorem 1 and theorem 2, assuming there's no room for improvement in execution times, so we've converted all the A into C that we can. And we've still got this. We've got the total utilisation is less than 100%, but we can't satisfy either theorem 1 or theorem 2. What's our verdict on that? Well, this inequality here is telling us that for the task set, there should be, at least theoretically, there's enough computational capacity to get all the work done that should be done. If the total processing utilisation is below 100%, that means, or equal to 100%, that means that the processor is actually idle part of the time. It's below 100%. And so, theoretically, we should be able to get all the tasks done by their deadlines. However, it means that rate monotonic scheduling just isn't cutting the mustard. Right, so the problem is, in this case, the rate monotonic scheduling policy is not delivering what the hardware says should be possible. What would we do about that? Yeah?
Do it manually, define manually what, if we exactly know when each process starts, we will need another scheduling policy.
Yeah, that's right. We need another scheduling policy. It just means that rate monotonic isn't good enough. And what sort of scheduling policy would we use? We'd use a dynamic scheduling policy, like earliest deadline first. And we would see if that would work. Because again, that expression is telling us that the hardware is suggesting that it should be possible. It's just that it's apparently not possible with rate monotonic. So we would look at a different scheduling policy, the dynamic one. What's the disadvantage of doing that? Yeah.
Maybe it's not so easy to prove.
That's right. That's right. We forfeit the sort of deterministic guarantees we get with a static scheduling policy if we start using a dynamic one. So the static scheduling policies are a little bit excessive in terms of the resource requirements they have. That's what this is telling us here. This question is reminding us of that, basically. The static scheduling policies are conservative there. However, they give us rock-solid guarantees that we know. If we build the system properly and we apply the power button, we know we can walk away and leave it, and it'll always move its deadlines. Doesn't matter what's going on. Worst case scenario, guaranteed. We don't get that sort of luxury with the dynamic scheduling policies. And for some people, that might be good enough. But for many hard real-time systems, it's better to have that guarantee. Okay, last part. What does it mean if the total processing utilisation is more than 100%? Yep, it's just hardware upgrade. You're going nowhere. And in fact, just that test on its own is something which is reasonably straightforward for a systems designer to do and provides a very valuable piece of information. In the bad old days, before this analysis was actually being applied properly, it wasn't even possible to know whether that condition could be met. People would build real-time systems and then test them. And if they failed the tests, well, that's bad news. We don't really know where to look. Maybe we should upgrade the hardware. Who knows what? It's anyone's guess. At least this time round, before any coding is done, essentially, if you've got an ability to estimate what the execution times might be, you of course are going to get the curious from elsewhere. You can, given a certain hardware platform, determine whether or not the total utilisation is greater or less than 100%. So there's the first test. That really should be question 1, not question 8. Okay, so the answers are all there, as you know, and there are some comments there, including some no comments, that's fine. The comments are basically cut-down versions of all the extra verbiage that I've been dragging you through over the last hour while we've been looking at this. So have a look at the comments later on if you like, but if you've been making notes and thinking about this while we've been working through them, then the comments aren't going to tell you anything extra.
Isn't the big problem today to get the correct execution times?
Yeah, you need the maximum execution time.
Or the maximum execution?
Yeah, that's right. Depending upon the complexity of the process, that's right. You can sometimes get that from the profiling tools that you're using too, depending upon their level of sophistication. You can get maximum execution times. It depends what tools you've got.
And the processor, I mean, I heard it takes a long time to, if I have a complex processor with out-of-order execution. And
yeah, that's right.
Something
that's right.
And then it's getting hard to.
That's right. That's right. And often features like speculative execution, onboard caches, all that sort of stuff, which speed up the average execution time, are ones that need to be disabled if you want to find out what the maximum execution time is. All right. That takes care of homework set number 1. We now do the second one. Moving straight along. Homework assignment 2. Don't worry about that first page there. That just had a whole bunch of timelines on it, which disappeared. We don't need to worry about that. Move straight on to the questions. Given the following information about 3 periodic tasks, A, B, and C, execution times 1, 2, and 1, periods 5, 7, and 4. What's the total utilisation of the set? Well, that's quite simply the CI over the TI, all added up. So we can look at that if we want to, but I don't think anyone will have any trouble with that, that calculation. Part B. Is the set of tasks schedulable? Again, apply theorem 1. If theorem 1 tells us what we need to know, good. If not, we apply theorem 2. It's the same process as before. This time round, we apply theorem 1. It's satisfied. U of 3 is 77.9%. So we don't need to do any more work for that one. So this is a really easy question, this one. Identify the highest and lowest priority task when using rate monotonic priorities. That we can do. There's the shortest period. There's the longest period. Part D. Assuming that all the tasks are assigned rate monotonic priorities, draw the timeline starting all 3 tasks at time t equals 0. So we draw the highest priority task at the top, and we draw multiple periods of it to start with, and then the next highest priority task, and then the next highest priority task until we're done. So here, we're drawing the highest priority task on the top. It wants to run 1 time unit every 4 time units, so we show that. Task A is the next highest priority task, show it running 1 time unit every 5 time units. There's a period there, show that. And then task B, starting at time t equals 2, worst case phasing when they all want to start at once. It completes execution by time t equals 4, when its period is actually 7. So we've drawn a trivial time a Gantt chart there, which didn't tell us anything we didn't already know because it satisfied theorem 1 anyway. Okay, add 1 unit of execution time to task B and calculate the total utilisation of the resulting task set. Is that then schedulable according to theorem 1? So 1 unit of execution time to task B, so that goes from 2 to 3. Again, we plug in the numbers, and so there it is, execution time is now 3, not 2. Total utilisation is more than 77.9%, so may not be schedulable, is what we would write, of course. But again, when we apply theorem 2, we see that it is schedulable. So down to time t is 7, the processor is 100% utilised, it's 100% busy, but all tasks are meeting their deadlines. And so the comment here is sufficient but not necessary, theorem 1. We knew that already. Alright, so very easy question, just to get us moving there. Question 2. Assess the schedulability of the following task set. Of course, that's just a wanky way of saying apply theorem 1, and if that doesn't work, apply theorem 2. So that's what we do. Apply theorem 1. Here we are. Utilisation for A and B. Well, what's the utilisation for A? 20%. Utilisation for A and B, 70%. That's okay. Utilisation for A, B and C is 91.4%, which is unfortunately more than the theoretical upper bound says. And so, as it says here, the numerical test is necessary for task C. And the numerical test is another way of saying we've got to draw the Gantt charts, we've got to draw the timelines, in other words, apply theorem 2. Now, there it is. Again, task A, the highest priority task, draw that one right across the timeline first, as many times as we need, then B, then C, and we discover that the tasks all meet their deadlines. That's fine. But the comment down here is interesting. Have a look at those inequalities. Where the hell do they come from? We haven't seen anything like that yet. That's certainly not doing Layland's theorem 1, is it? No. Well, I'll show you where it comes from. It comes from theorem 2. What we've got here in the comment section after question 2 is we've got this symbolic form of theorem 2 being expanded out. So if we apply theorem 2 in the symbolic form, in other words, if we did this test, that's what it looks like in practice. Let's see if we can interpret what it means. First of all, we've got these instants in time being referred to down here. They're obviously specific. A, B, C, D, and E, uppercase A, B, and C, and D, and E. They're called scheduling points. And they're relevant to the test for theorem 2, scheduling points. How do we define what a scheduling point is? We might say that's the point when scheduling gets done. No, that's not quite right. A scheduling point is an instant in time at which new work is required to be commenced. In other words, a scheduling point is a point in time at which a process needs to start running again. Might have run before, needs to start running again. That's what a scheduling point is. An instant in time at which new work needs to commence. And the idea behind theorem 2 is we visit all these scheduling points and we work out whether or not that all the work that needs to have been done by that point in time has been or hasn't. And if it has, then we've satisfied the time and domain requirements of the system. And so what we've got down here, each one of these unusual looking inequalities, each one of these expressions, is related to this sequence of points in time, these scheduling points here, A, B, C, D, and E, And basically what we're doing is we're looking at whether or not all the work that needs to have been done by that point in time has been. Have a look at that first inequality. 1C1 plus 1C2 plus 1C3 is less than or equal to 1T1. What that test is doing is it's saying, let's take the first scheduling point, which is time A. And why is that a scheduling point? Because at time A, new work has to commence. In other words, task A, lowercase a, has to start running for the second time. That's why uppercase A is a scheduling point, because it meets the definition we just had. Well, that point in time is 1 times period for task 1, or task A. What we're doing is we're seeing if 1 times C1 is less than 1 times T1. Again, that's the trivial test. But we're also seeing whether or not the other two tasks have also completed their work within that time. Strictly speaking, they don't have to, because task 1 times C2, that doesn't have to be done until the period for task B, that's down here, time t equals 6. And 1 times C3, that really doesn't have to be completed. In other words, task C doesn't really have to be complete until here, time t equals 14. So this test here is a pretty extravagant one. It's saying, let's see if not only task 1, but the other two tasks, which have got much longer deadlines, see if they've all been done by the first period. And of course, if they have, then we need to go no further. All tasks will meet their deadlines. Does that make sense? Yeah. They haven't though, so what we do is move to the next scheduling point, and we do the same test there. So the next scheduling point is 1 times T2. That is the period for task B, lowercase b. And the test there, of course, is, has task B, C2 there, has that been completed by 1 times T2? That's a trivial test. But over here we've got 2 times C1. Why is it 2 times C1 now? It's 2 times C1 because this scheduling point here, uppercase B, it's within the second period for task A. And when the second period for task A is complete, task A needs to have run twice. And we're testing to see whether at time t equals 6, whether task A has run twice. Obviously, it doesn't really need to run twice until time t equals 10. But if it's run twice by time t equals 6, then we're going to be happy with that. It's actually got its work done earlier than it needed to, so it's met its deadline. And again, if we've managed to squeeze in 2 iterations of the highest priority task, plus the task in question, plus the lower priority task, which doesn't need to have completed by this point in time, but if it has, then we'll be happy. So we add up 2C1 plus 1C2 plus 1C3 and test that against 1 times T2. But that inequality is not satisfied either. Alright, so we move down to the next scheduling point C. That's the beginning of the third period for task A. So by that point in time, task A needs to finish twice, 2 C1s. We're part of the way through the second period for task B. So we've got 2 C2s there. And, of course, we're still within the first period for task C. And we're testing against 2 times T1. Time T equals 10. 2 times 5. Alright, that doesn't work. So we move to the next scheduling point, D, and we do the test there. And of course at time D, we need to have completed, hopefully, 3 times task A, 2 times task B, and maybe 1 times task C, even though 1 times task C really doesn't need to be complete for another 2 time units. And when we plug in that, we find that the inequality is in fact met. At that point, we can stop. Because we've proven that the tasks will all meet their deadlines at scheduling point D, 2 times T2. So that's theorem 2 working in the symbolic form for us. Notice that we can't just go to the last scheduling point and do that test down there, because that one fails. We have to find one of these scheduling points whereby all the work that needs to be done by that point in time, perhaps maybe even more work than needs to be done by that point in time, has been. And if we can find one of those, then the tasks have met their deadlines. These integer coefficients here, they're a result of this ceiling operator here. Right? We'll have a look at the floor and ceiling operators much more next week, but the ceiling operator takes a floating point number, takes a ratio, and rounds it towards plus infinity. So this thing here, that is not a pair of brackets. Right? That's the ceiling operator. Those little tabs at the top there, not being down the bottom, that's significant. But again, I'll talk to you with that next week. In fact, I'm going to close that one now. We don't need it anymore. All right, so what we've got is we've got a reasonably straightforward application of theorem 2 in the graphical depiction of it there, the timeline. But we've also got theorem 2 being applied in symbolic form down the bottom there, with those unusual looking inequalities we haven't seen before. Okay, that takes care of that one. Last question, question 3. Given the following tasks, 1, 2, 3, and interrupt. I don't know what this is supposed to mean, priority high, medium, low. We know what the priorities are if we're assigning rate monotonic anyway. 50, 75, 100, 200, that tells us everything we need to know. And the execution times are shown there. Build a schedulability model for the task set. Again, that just means apply theorem 1, and if that doesn't work, apply theorem 2. All right, so we apply theorem 1, and this is what we get. We've got for task 1, we've got C1 over T1 plus a blocking factor, CDI over T1. Where does that blocking factor come from? The blocking factor comes from the fact that we're told here in the question that this task down here, the one with execution time 15 and period 200, is interrupt. So that's entirely an interrupt service routine. 15 time units of blocking factor is going to be experienced by all 3 higher priority tasks. That's what we predict is going to occur there straight away. So we've moved straight to using the extended model for theorem 1. For task 2, we've got a preemption factor there, C1 over T1. The task's own execution factor, C2 over T2. And again, the blocking factor, Ci over T2. And finally, for task 3, C1 over T1 plus C2 over T2, both those terms together make the preemption factor. That's why there's an uppercase P there, above those two, which is correct. We've got C3 over T3, that's the task's own execution factor, and the blocking factor, Ci over T3. Why is there no preemption factor up here for task 1? Yeah. It's the highest priority task in the system, can't be preempted by anything else. It can be blocked, but it can't be preempted. All right, and then down the bottom, Ci over Ti is less or equal to 1. Now, is that what we expected to see? Why isn't it C1 over T1 plus C2 over T2 plus C3 over T3 plus Ci over Ti is less or equal to U of 4?
Because
What?
it's done on one hit. So that doesn't have an interrupt part and a running part. It's done on one go.
That's right. This is an interrupt service routine. It's being scheduled by the hardware. It doesn't give a toss what operating system is running, let alone what scheduling policy. So none of this you of anything means any sense to it. Not relevant at all. It's simply got to ensure that the execution time is less than the period, which is precisely what that test is showing us there. End of story. Rate monotonic, deadline monotonic, earliest deadline first, doesn't matter what scheduling policy, right? It's an interrupt. Alright? Does that all make sense to everyone? I want those four expressions to be quite straightforward to everyone by this stage. Good. Alright, that's actually very good. Okay, they plug in the numbers now, and they discover that of the three tasks, of the four tasks, one of which is an interrupt service routine, T3 fails the test. So T3, task 3 fails the numerical test theorem 1. And so what they've done here is they've moved on and applied theorem 2, and they've picked the scheduling points, time t is 50, 75, and 100. And they've discovered that at scheduling point 100 here, the inequality is satisfied. So by theorem 2, in the symbolic form there, the tasks do meet their deadlines. We could have applied theorem 2 in the graphical form, drawing out the timelines, and discovered the same thing. Okay, so once again, theorem 1 is conservative. Alright, so that takes care of part A, build a schedulability model for task set. Part B, given the conditions in A, assume that task 3 is composed of two sections, 3A and 3B, where the execution times are 30 and 10, respectively. Section 3A is non-preemptible and non-interruptible. Set up a new schedulability model. Alright, so the 40 time units of execution for task 3 is now going to be modified, and the first 30 time units of it, we're going to have interrupts disabled. After 30 time units, we re-enable interrupts, of course, that's just one assembly language statement to do that. Work out what effect this has now. So obviously, we're going to have two blocking factors. We're going to have a blocking factor caused by the interrupt service routine, we saw that before, but a portion of task 3 is now going to act as a blocking factor to these higher priority tasks, 1 and 2. That's what we anticipate, and sure enough, that's what we've got. So there are the expressions. For task 1, we've got, again, no preemption factor. It's the highest priority task in the system. It's got its own execution factor, C1 over T1, but the blocking factor is made up of two terms. There's the interrupt service routine, CI over T1, and there's the non-preemptible, non-interruptible portion of task 3, C3A, we're calling that, over T1. That's got to be less than or equal to 1. Right, so two additive terms making up the blocking factor. Same deal goes for task 2. It can be preempted by task 1. There's its own execution factor, just as we would have seen many times now. And then there's the blocking factor, Ci plus C3A over T2. Does that statement of the test for task 3 make sense? C3A has disappeared from the analysis there. Sorry, mate?
It's gone into C3.
That's right, it's gone into C3. It can't block itself. Remember, blocking factors only have an impact upwards. So we've got two terms making up the preemption factor, the task's own execution factor, but of course, when task 3 wants to run, the interrupt service routine might be running. So we've got Ci over T3 there. Correct. So that statement is correct. What about the last one? Does that make sense? Yeah? Does that make sense? Well, the first part should. Ci over Ci has got to be less than or equal to 1. That's obvious. But even the interrupt service routine now has got a blocking factor, because interrupts might be disabled for the portion of time taken to execute 3A, and that can occur during the interrupt service routine's period. So yeah, the interrupt service routine, acting as a blocking factor to all higher priority processes, is now experiencing its own blocking factor. A little bit of poetic justice there. Yeah.
When C3A is running,
Yep.
and an interrupt occurs, and the interrupt can't occur because it's blocked, and then C3A is done, is then the interrupt executed immediately.
That's right. The interrupt is held pending
And where is it held? And
in the hardware. The interrupt flag will be set.
alright.
Yeah. Unless we've enabled interrupts in the interrupt service routine, then the interrupt service routine can't be preempted, like you say, but the flag will be set. And then when the interrupt service routine is finished, when the non-interruptible portion of C3 is finished, it'll check the flag and discover an interrupt has occurred in the meantime. It'll then branch to the interrupt service routine. All right. Comments. They're plugged in the numbers basically, and 1, 2, and 3 are all failing theorem 1, and the only one that's meeting its deadline is the interrupt service routine. So our modification to task 3 there hasn't helped things much at all, has it? Okay. Perform the numerical test, theorem 2, on task 1. There we are. So we've applied theorem 2 in its symbolic form to the highest priority task, which means we only go to the first scheduling point, that's the period for task 1, and we see whether or not task 1 has been able to complete within that time, plus the 2 blocking factors. And there's no point going any further with task 1. We were told to apply that to task theorem 2 to task 1. There's no point going any further because there's the deadline for task 1. It fails the test. Okay. It says task 1's unable to meet its first deadline under the worst case conditions and then still therefore not guaranteed to be scheduled. However, they've gone a bit further here. The question didn't ask for it, but in the comments here this has been included. The numerical test for theorem 2 has been applied for tasks 2 and 3. Theorem 1 told us that they were not schedulable. Theorem 2 is demonstrating here that they are. And again, we could have drawn a timeline to indicate or discover that, or apply the symbolic form, which is what they've done here to find out if that's the case. So they've visited the scheduling points, 50, 75, and 100, and they've looked around to see whether or not all the work that needs to be done by that point in time, and perhaps any extra work, can be done, and it meets the requirements out here, time t equals 75 for task 1, for task 2, and in here, time t equals 100 for task 3. So yet again, theorem 1 has been conservative. It suggested that tasks won't meet their deadlines, and in fact they do. All Right? That wasn't really called for in the question, but it's informative to do that in any case. And then back up here to the last part. Consider breaking up the non-preemptible section of task 3 into two smaller non-preemptible blocks of time. For example, C3A1, which is 10 time units, and C3A2, which is 20 time units. How does that affect things? Well, that's a pretty easy modification to make to the source code, because all we need to do is to insert two instructions. Re-enable interrupts after time 10, and then disable interrupts again straight away. So, within the block of instructions, which takes 30 time units to execute, and is normally non-preemptible and non-interruptible, we just insert two more instructions, re-enable interrupts, and then straight away disable interrupts. We haven't had to modify the algorithm at all. Whatever it is that those instructions are doing doesn't need to be changed. We just simply insert two instructions in there. That makes sense? Yeah, easy. All right, we're going to find out now what impact that has on the schedulability of task 1. Remember, we don't have to worry about 2 and 3 because we just discovered by applying theorem 2 that they do meet their deadlines. So it's only task 1, which is the problem here. So it's only task 1 that we want to do the numerical test for. Remember, 2 and 3 have been shown to meet their deadlines. Yeah. So it's only task 1. Have a look at that. Where does that come from? C1 over T1 plus Ci over T1 plus max of C3A1 and C3A2 over T1 less than or equal to 1. Does that make sense? Yeah, it does. What do we have before? It might be a bit easier to compare when we have a look at it. There, that's what we had before. That's what we had before up the top there. C1 over T1 plus Ci over T1 plus C3A over T1. Now, by making that very simple modification to the code for task 3, they're saying this is the new test. How does that manifest itself? How does that appear? What does this mean? Maxed C3A1, C3A2. What's that? That's right. Exactly, yeah. Yeah. Only one of these, C3A1 or C3A2, can act as a blocking factor on any one occasion to task 1. Not both of them added together. Because we've made that modification to the code where we re-enable interrupts and then disable them again. And it's just that that provides task 1, the higher priority task, with a window opportunity to preempt task 3 and run. What we've done is we've modified task 3 now to be partially preemptible. It's not fully preemptible, as in task 1 can interrupt task 3 whenever it wants. Right? It's not fully preemptible, that's the case we would like it to be. But it's partially preemptible. We know that it will only run for, at most, 30 time units before interrupts are re-enabled, and when that occurs, task 1 will be able to be treated like task 1 should be, the highest priority task in the system. All right? An important and realistic example of that one. We never get everything nice and neat and cut and dry like we want it to be. We never get a set of independent tasks with no blocking factors and no monkey business going on. Right? That never happens. And so this analysis needs to be applied on a case-by-case basis, taking into account the characteristics of the tasks. And it can do that, just as we've seen. Not only that, it can recommend to us what changes we should make. And the last thing is, it can tell us when we can stop making modifications. We don't need to test and test and test and test something until it seems to work every time, which is what used to happen in the bad old days. Now we've got a proof. We've got a priori certainty that the task will meet their deadlines if they satisfy these tests. Fantastic stuff. And of course, if we plug in the numbers, we see the inequality is now satisfied for task 1. But that again is something of an anticlimax. This is the real, that's the real target, being able to understand that. Okay, questions? All right. We should have a look at a few of the tutorial problems then before we finish up. What's the time? 7:30? Yeah, we should do a few of these. And then we can mop up anything else that needs to be dealt with next week again, I think. So, we've got some POSIX programming problems, which are very straightforward in that they don't ask you to write any source code. That's what the assignment's for. The exam's not for writing source code, that's what the assignment is all about. So, we've got some straightforward problems that only require 1 or 2 sentence descriptive responses to, and you can answer all of these just out of the PowerPoint slides. So, really straightforward. Who's had a look through these and wants clarification on any of the answers that we've already got available? Who's looked through these? All right. Well, maybe I can pick a few at random, and we can look at them, and then you can have a look at them between now and whatever. And if there are any you don't like the look of, then we'll deal with them. All right. What does the wait system call for? Is it to wait on a semaphore? No. What's it for? It's to get a parent process to be moved off the active state, blocked, until a child process terminates or executes an exec instruction. So if we've got a parent process, creates a child process, if the parent process is dependent upon the output from that child process, then it makes sense to have the parent process not continue to execute. In other words, doing busy waiting. Instead, we should get that process to be blocked, moved into a waiting queue, and then automatically notified when the child process terminates or when the child process doesn't exec. And then the parent could be rewoken again, moved to the ready queue. So it's got nothing to do with semaphores. What is, in fact, the correct system call applied to POSIX semaphores to do the attempted decrement operation? That's the sem underscore wait. The sem underscore wait and sem underscore post. All right, what does the fork system call do? Duplicate the parent process. What sort of things are different between the parent and child? Yeah, that's right. Yep, process ID. And there are a few other things that are different too. timers get reset, and file handles get removed, and stuff like that. All right, what's the exec system call about? That's getting a process to run a different program to the one it's currently running. The child inherits the program that their parent is executing. And if we want to redirect the child to run a different program, then that's the way in which we do it, with one of the 6 different exec system calls. What about you make a call to fork and the return value is 0? What does that tell us? Yeah, that's right. And it tells us that the fork call was successful as well. And it tells us 2 things. The fork call was successful and we're executing instructions in the child. POSIX 1 signals, what were they all about? Two more appropriate uses for POSIX 1 signals. Signals are good for asynchronous event notification, aren't they? Exception handling, IO events, that sort of stuff. Okay. This one people get wrong a lot. What does the kill function do? Kills the process. Wrong. What does the kill function do? Yeah, that's right. Question 15 answers question 16. The kill function sends a signal to a process. Doesn't necessarily kill it at all. Depends what the handler does. Pipes and fire firms. Why must a pipe be created before the fork system call? Well, first of all, what's the fork system call even got to do with a pipe? If a process creates a pipe and it doesn't make a call to fork afterwards, what's it do with the pipe? Not bloody much. We make a call to fork after pipe so that the child process can inherit the file descriptors of the pipe. And then we've got 2 processes that can read from or write to the pipe. If we make the call to fork before the call to pipe, what's going to happen? Yeah, the parent will have the pipe, or the child will have the pipe. Whoever created the pipe will have the pipe, and no one else will. That's one of the things that sucks. And that's why we prefer FIFOs over pipes, isn't it? Yes. Because now we can have any 2 unrelated processes communicating using a pipe. So that answers question 24. What about 25? POSIX 4 offers a memory locking facility. Most people get this one wrong by saying memory locking. Oh, that sounds like stopping race conditions. Wrong. What does memory locking do? It locks memory, sure enough, but it's not for data security at all. It's for something else. Right, it circumvents the virtual memory manager, doesn't it? Why would we want to do that? Chapters 8 and 9 of the textbook told us what a great thing virtual memory was. Why might we now want to circumvent it, undermine it?
Guarantee it stays
Yeah, that's right. So that we know what the worst case latency is going to be. And we wouldn't want to do this too frequently. We wouldn't want to be excessive. Otherwise, we might as well not have virtual memory at all. But there might be some processes, the real-time ones, hard real-time ones, that we don't want being managed by the virtual memory manager. We don't want to have their pages, the pages that those processes are using, being swapped backwards and forwards between primary memory and disk. So there'll be instances where we say to the memory manager, virtual memory manager, do what you like to those other processes over there, but keep your hands off these ones. Must stay in memory. Okay. What does this system call do? mmap. And again, people say maps memory.
Yeah, maps physical memory to virtual memory.
Yeah, it sort of does. Yeah. It will arrange for shared memory region to be accessible within the process space of a running process. So if you remember back to those shared memory examples that we had a look at, the actual POSIX source code, we created a pointer to a character but didn't initialize it. And then after we created the shared memory, opened it and truncated it and all that sort of stuff, we made a call to mmap, and mmap gave us the actual address of the shared memory region, or the offset unit, if we wanted that. And we stored that address in our pointer to character. So yes, we were having some physical memory that existed somewhere within the machine environment, we don't know where, being mapped into our process's address space. So that's what that was doing. What about these two scheduling policies, round robin and FIFO? We know what round robin does, because we've seen that heaps of times. What does the shed FIFO scheduling policy do to the processes? Of course, it's got nothing to do with FIFOs as in named pipes. That's just another bit of namespace trouble we've got. How does shed FIFO work? What's its behaviour?
First in, first out.
Hmm?
First in, first out.
Yeah, it's actually a priority-based scheduler. It'll run the highest priority process that's ready to run and keep running until it's either finished or it yields the processor. So it picks the highest priority process and runs it for as long as it likes. Does that make sense to us at all? Yes, it does. That's what a rate monotonic scheduler should do. Run the highest priority task. When it's finished, run the next highest priority task. When that's done, run the next highest priority task. And if any time over that interval, the highest priority task wants to run it again, well, we run it until it's finished. So the behaviour, the semantics of this scheduling policy is exactly what we want for rate monotonic analysis to be applied in practice. It's as if someone was actually had their thinking cap on when they came up with that, isn't it? Yes. What's the relationship between clocks and timers? Like in one sentence. We say the clocks are the real hardware devices, and the timers are like logical clocks that we attach to timers. And we can have multiple timers per real hardware clock. And that's actually a good design. So we run a test program on our hardware platform, whatever it is, to find out what real hardware clocks are available and their resolutions. And then we set up POSIX timers, attaching them to these clocks to get them to either strobe events for us in the case of a periodic timer, or to do one-shot operations for us, monostables. So we can create as many of these as we like. Right. What do we need for rate monotonic scheduling to be possible? What features of an operating system do we need for rate or deadline monotonic? Yep. That's right. We just basically need a priority-based preemptive scheduler. We haven't done the deadline monotonic stuff yet. We'll do that next week. What's priority inversion? Yeah, that's what we found out about tonight. Sometimes people say, oh, that's when you get the highest priority and make it shortest period. They think that's priority inversion. You're getting a bit mixed up there. That's not priority inversion, is it? How might we incorporate the extra overhead of system call into rate monotonic analysis? Because, like Ruth said last week, we just pretend that context switching takes 0 time.
Blocking factor.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, an extra bit of blocking factor. Why? Because usually the kernels themselves can't be preempted. Usually the kernels are non-preemptible, which means once a user level process switches from user level to kernel level, supervised mode, privileged mode, the Intel people call it, we can't interrupt the kernel while that's actually happening. The kernel can't interrupt itself. It usually disables interrupts. And as soon as we hear disable interrupts, we think blocking factor. So if we measured how long, and we can do this very accurately if we've got the source code to the operating system we're using, if we measured how long it took in terms of the instructions that are executed whenever a context switching operation occurs, we can include that as a blocking factor. We know that RMA is conservative, don't we? Yeah, I spelled that out a couple of times tonight. This is a question that pops up from time to time. Rate monotonic analysis is known to be optimal when compared to other static scheduling policies for real-time systems. What does optimal mean in this context? Because one of the questions from homework 1, the second last question, said to us, what do we do if we've got total CPU utilization being below 100%, yet rate monotonic analysis here in 1 and 2 can't be satisfied? Remember that question?
It doesn't guarantee it, but it could be possible.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, we said we would move to a dynamic scheduling policy. So question 41 is really saying, if we can come up with some arbitrary static scheduling policy, not rate monotonic, not deadline monotonic, we're going to look at next week, but, you know, my own scheduling policy, a static one, and if it can schedule a bunch of processes to always meet their deadlines, then rate monotonic will be able to as well. That's what it means. So you come up with any other static priority assignment and demonstrate those tasks and meet their deadlines, then all you've done is make more work for yourself, because rate monotonic would have done it anyway. These are the formulae, and they're quoted just like that in the exam paper. So don't bother learning those. These ones here, of course, we'll look at next week. But there's Lewin-Lehman's theorem at the top there. We know all about that now. All right. right, let's just finish up by doing this one here. We've got a particular real-time system, 5 independent processors sharing one processor using the RMA, time domain parameters are, blah, blah, blah. What assumption must be made before Lewin-Leyland's theorem can be first applied? We're assuming that we're going to be able to model the aperiodic processes as periodic ones. That's our assumption. And how do we justify that? Worst case analysis. Where we will be accommodating the aperiodic processes running at much more frequent time intervals than we would really expect them to run in practice. Is the task set schedulable by Lewin-Leyland's theorem 1? Well, I don't know, I can't remember. What do we do? 0.2 divided by 1.2 plus 0.3 divided by 2 plus 0.4 divided by 3 plus 0.2 divided by 1.5 plus 0.3 divided by 2.5. Add them all up. See if it's less than equal to U of 5. If it is, what do we say? Yep, great. If the inequality is not satisfied, what do we write down? May not be. That's right.
Yes, it's greater than 1.
Sorry, mate?
It's greater than 1, and yes, not.
That's right. All right, it looks like everyone's exhausted. Maybe we'll pick up on the rest of these next week. So let's just be sure that we're prepared properly for next week. It's good if you get a chance to look at this before the lecture, but it doesn't really matter if you don't. I don't think anyone ever has at all. But the first 18 pages of that document there, either print that out and bring it with you, or have it available in electronic form, whatever, because that's what we're going to be working through. I'll do much the same thing as I did tonight with the homework problems, working through that document. Plus, there'll be another lecture, another set of PowerPoint slides, not very long, included underneath this heading too, on the dynamic scheduling policies. And we'll have a look at that as well. And then that's it. We're pretty much done.